So please take that into account. If you would like to ask questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat box, and one of us will be paying attention and we will call on you from there. If you could, thank you. Just to put in a little bit of context for you where this came from, the screen that is showing is the National Technical Assistance Center's Disproportionality and Equity Work Group. So all of the people whose names that you see on the screen have had some part in creating or addressing disproportionality and equity within the PBIS framework. This is a relatively new work group. It's been around about 4 years, and its task is really, the group exists really to develop and provide resources in a couple different areas. One is culturally responsive practices, which is where the field guide comes out of. There is a group that's looking at data and data disaggregation and creating sort of some technical assistance manuals on how to disaggregate data. So beyond risk ratios, really going from things like risk ratio into how do you use this in a building on a regular basis. There is some material on policy analysis. There is some information on implicit bias as well. So if you go to, and there's a link at the end of the webinar, if you go to pbis.org and you go to the equity section, that's where you can find a lot of the material that this work group has developed. In addition to technical guides and research, though, there's also some presentations and material that you can use for presentations as well. If you can go to the next slide, please.
And that website is being updated as soon as materials come out and are published. They're put right on that website. That's the first place that they go. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
So the field guide really is intended as a resource. It's not a standalone. It is not something that you're going to be able to kind of thumb through and figure out how to solve any issues of disparity that you have in your building or in your district. Identity work that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes is absolutely essential to creating systems that are going to be responsive to all student needs. In a few minutes, we'll talk about the identity sections and where you kind of focus and what kind of identities we're talking about. But the thing to keep in mind as we go into this is that identity work has to happen either prior to using this guide or concurrent with using this guide. We can't ignore it. The identity pieces are essential as the linchpins in creating culturally responsive practices. In the guide, we talk about this concept called VAB, or Validation, Affirmation, Building, and Bridging. And VAB is that linchpin between what students know coming into our buildings, the cultural knowledge, the values, the history that they come to us with, and then the building and bridging piece, which is the school's responsibility and which is where culturally responsive practices live. In order for VAB to work, identity work has to be done. So just kind of want to preface that. The second thing to understand is that the guide helps schools build culturally responsive systems. It is not a cultural responsiveness guide. Cultural responsiveness is really a whole bunch of concepts, from pedagogy and material that's used to understanding our own identities as practitioners, understanding the cultures that we serve. And there's no way to write a definitive guide on every single culture and every definition of culture. And honestly, I mean, if we did something like that, it would be a lot of kind of generalizations and it still wouldn't get to the level that we want. So if we look at this from a system standpoint, what this guide allows us to do is really kind of think about how our system interfaces with the families and stakeholders we serve, and allows us to make some explicit connections to make those relationships a lot stronger than they currently are. The guide is intended for use by coaches or the leadership teams. It's not something that you want to hand out to everybody on the team and say, read cover to cover. Frankly, as much as I think we love the guide, that would probably be either cruel and unusual punishment to make everybody do that, or it would be the cure for insomnia. It's really intended to be used as a way to guide action planning, data use as a PBIS team, and start prioritizing or figuring out where you want to start creating a culturally responsive system.
And Kent, did you mention that the guide is available in the materials section of the go-to training control panel? Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to be sure.
Yeah, it's okay. We've had some more people come in, so it's always good for them to hear it too. When we look at data, this is also one of those things that we've learned over time. And this is kind of one of those caveats to keep in mind as we start talking about the guide. In it, we talk about the use of this concept called risk ratio. And for some of you that are newly trained teams or more recently trained teams at Tier 1, we talked about risk ratio as part of our universal training. It's important to understand that risk ratio is where the conversation begins. Risk ratio is the thing that says, hey, something's going on in the system. It doesn't tell you what's going on in the system. It's not diagnostic, but it is a prompt for your system to pay attention, to dig in, to dig deeper, to create those precision statements. The other thing that we want to have people understand is that risk ratio is a way of looking at systems. When we started having these conversations a few years ago, we collectively, and I think for both Mulaney and I specifically, had conversations about if we were able to present a risk ratio, that it would be startling to the systems and it would really help create mobilization, that it would help systems kind of say, whoa, something's going on, we need to do better. The thing is, you really can't shame systems into righteousness. What we have to do is use risk ratio to kind of illustrate how systems are operating and to put it into context. So what both of us do when we train this, when we train culturally responsive systems training, when we train PBIS, we always talk about risk ratio from the big picture to local level. So we'll always talk about risk ratio within national data trends. So things like risk ratio for certain students of color to get particular outcomes is like 3 times that of white students. We'll move it to the state level and talk about those same risk for outcomes at a state level. We move it to the district level. We move it to the building level. Because what we want people to understand is that we're not generally creating racist systems. We're not creating buildings that are, actively finding ways to be discriminatory towards students. What it does show is that our systems were built in a very specific way. They were built based on a particular culture. And what the risk ratio does is kind of shows from the top down that this is a pattern and a trend. And it allows us to frame this conversation as a way of looking at how do we disrupt that system? How do we change how that system operates rather than projecting blame, which allows, I think, teams to have a little bit more traction. Next slide.
A couple other things to think about that are really critical in this work is that when you first introduce this conversation, it's very easy, I think, for teams. And like Kent said, we've been talking about this with teams for a while. It's sometimes more comfortable to talk about gender or poverty issues, like to disaggregate your data based on gender or poverty. But our encouragement there is for teams to not just stick with that, but to move past it to eventually look at race. So it is definitely an issue if you look at office discipline referral patterns across the nation and in our state. We do see many more boys identified with office referrals than we see girls, because girls tend to just generally, this is a generalization, tend to have behaviors that are more like socially manipulative or more internalizing type behaviors than what our boys tend to show. And that can be a really important conversation for some of our schools, because our schools are not always set up for the kinds of boys that need more activity and need more movement within their day. So that can be a valuable conversation, and we don't want to negate that. But we do want you to be careful not to hang out in that gender or poverty area at the expense of talking about kids that are a different race from your staff or the majority of your population. When we look at race in terms of race versus poverty and those kinds of things, what we find and what we see in the data is that race is actually a much bigger predictor of success than poverty. So to put it quite bluntly, what we see in our Wisconsin data academically is that our rich Black students, and again, I'm putting this bluntly, our rich Black students tend to perform worse than even our poor or our low socioeconomic status white students. And what that tells us is there's a systems issue there, because those students have the same level of potential, but the systems issue then is something's going on within what we're doing that is leading to those negative or lesser outcomes. And then the last bullet here on this page is that systems and practices are both of equal importance. So what we sometimes see is a school that will lean really heavily on classroom practices. Those are very important, they're critical. But unless there's a system in place to support them, to help the teachers understand how to do them, to make sure that that work continues and sustains, then it will not be as impactful as it could be, and vice versa. If you have a system with reminders and pieces in place, but you don't have the strong practices to implement at that classroom level or at the school-wide level, then you'll be missing out on some things that could be really positive and beneficial for your students. And those practices might not sustain.
One of the other things that comes up, and I think this is another place where we need to have some candid, frank, and courageous conversations with the schools that we support, is the small N phenomenon. Invariably, when we talk about culturally responsive practices, statewide and nationally, the comments come up that, well, we only have one or two of those students or those families, right? And what we need to kind of do is flip this conversation, and we need to put this conversation into language of multi-level systems of support. We've built multi-level systems of supports into our schools with the understanding that a solid foundation will be able to support all students, including the students that are a small number. When we talk about it from a behavior standpoint, we talk about it as students that are needing those intensive interventions. When we talk about it from an academic standpoint, we talk about, that tier 3 piece as being certainly supportive interventions, but also things like gifted and talented and enrichment and things like that. So we understand fundamentally within an RTI framework that we're building a system that will respond to all students' needs. That being said, we need to apply the same logic when we're talking about culturally responsive practices. That we're not building a system for a small number of students, we're building a system that will support all students. The other thing that we need to do is kind of flip this conversation to that comment. The comment that we only have one or two of those particular students, whoever those is in a building. When we say things like, well, but it's only blank, what we are doing is essentially delegitimizing, minimizing those students, their histories, and their cultures. That somehow the outcome of those particular students is less valuable than the 99% of the other students that the system works for. So in all of these cases, we need to be able to address this head on in a way that helps people understand really that we need to shift the conversation. Not necessarily blaming, but getting people to think about what we've built and how we look at students. Another effective way of doing this is looking at it from that standpoint of kind of bigger picture demographics, and you see it on the screen. By the year 2019, students of color are going to be the majority enrollment in our schools. And if what our jobs as educators is to create students that are able to effectively enter into the workplace and be part of a global economy, then that means also being able to understand how other cultures view the world, how other people move in the world. And what we're doing is truly equipping all students to be able to learn how to walk side by side rather than, standing toe to toe with other people that they interact with. The bottom line is that all students benefit from systems that are responsive and reflect multiple perspectives. So this issue will come up, especially in smaller districts, or where you have a less diverse enrollment. So be prepared to address this question, and be prepared to address this question head on. It will come up. Kind of go into this planfully, figuring out what's going to be your best way of addressing it and entering into that conversation.
One of the other things that, I'm sorry if I missed it when you mentioned this, Kent, but just a couple of thoughts. One is that when we look at just a few in each school and we think, oh, that outcome, like we can't really use that data because there aren't enough of them. What that adds up to on a statewide level, according to our data, is very, very disheartening. So just even if it's one student in each school in some of our more rural areas, when you add all of those students together and you add together all of their performance data, it's not a good picture. So clearly our systems aren't addressing that well. The other thing when we talk about this is that frequently when we bring up the identity work, it's kind of and I'm going to generalize again, but it can be kind of a surprise for some of our white educators to think about themselves having a culture. Because while I think we're all familiar with that term and we all talk about that term fairly openly, it's not necessarily something that we associate with people like us. And I say us being a white woman. So I think there is something else to be gained in that identity work, and linking the identity work to the we only have one or two or three comment or question, because that piece of the identity work, like recognizing that we all have multiple cultures that we move through on a daily basis, and that we need to acknowledge those and think about what they mean for our expectations for the people around us and for the students in our classroom, that can have a really big impact on this conversation as well.
So trying to go from sort of a big picture to a local picture for you with a slide. Wisconsin has a model to inform culturally responsive practices that incorporates 8 areas of cultural responsiveness. That's a little bit of a disconnection from how this guide was created to interface with the tiered fidelity inventory. The material borrows heavily from each other. You're going to see language and things within this guide that show up in Wisconsin's model to inform culturally responsive practices. However, because of how the tiered fidelity inventory was built, we are looking at things like identity, voice, the supportive environment, situational appropriateness, and data for equity. So it's not a one-to-one correlation between what you will see on Wisconsin's model to inform and the guide, but you're going to find all of those concepts embedded in both. They're just organized in a little bit different ways. So that's just kind of a heads up on how these concepts are going to show up within this field guide.
And part of the history of these 5 specific core components is coming out of the research that's around culturally responsive practices that the group that we're on was able to review prior to completing the guide. So that was another piece of it, that instead of tying solely to the TFI components and aligning only to that, we wanted there to be, and the group wanted there to be, a bigger picture of what are like the really core features of culturally responsive practices that need to be addressed.
So with the guide, this is kind of what we want to focus on for the rest of this webinar. Now that we've kind of given you the background of where this has come from and some of the logic behind this and the things that you need to know. The introduction goes into the background more in terms of things like the logic, the academic research, the scholarly material, the why of doing this. as well as how to use the guide. The identity development section are the things that we want to consider when we talk about identity: the practitioner identity, the student and family identity, the school identity, the community identities. And we'll unpack that in just a second as well. So the identity development section, as we go through this, is going to talk about how can you start moving staff in a way that are going to help them understand what they bring into the equation, and how they move based on their identity is going to either engage students or isolate and disengage. The components themselves are kind of the meat of the guide from a technical standpoint, which is where we took each of the line items from Tier 1 in the TFI and embed culturally responsive practice components into it, as we'll show you in a minute, kind of giving some logic what ideals look like, what non-examples look like, as well as resources and where to get more information. And lastly, a pretty comprehensive appendix. The appendix itself, we kind of went round and round, whether or not to keep it included in this or split it off as a second a companion to the companion. But it has key terms, materials, examples, and things like that. And we'll walk you through that as well in just a second.
So the first section is kind of the how to use this guide. And as Kent mentioned, that he talked about the sections and the appendices, but what we'll outline later again is that there are multiple points of entry for this work. This is not linear. I have the kind of personality that I would love it to be, but it just is not. It is very messy and sometimes uncomfortable. And what we've determined is that following a sort of sequence might be the best approach. So we would really recommend that identity awareness be addressed very early on. This is what the guide actually looks like. This is a page straight out of it. And that you're talking with your staff and finding ways to ensure that your staff are thinking about how their identity, their culture affects their school and their classroom cultures and what they expect from their students. And then the next part would really be to dig into the TFI Companion, essentially, and start either from a strength on the TFI and try to enhance a practice that's already there, or start with a need area and try to build in the culturally responsive enhancements that you need to have from the very beginning. So again, you won't hear us say, this is exactly the way to do it, step 1, step 2, step 3, but you will hear us allude to these two approaches essentially, mainly, I think you could say.
So the identity development pieces, we've said to you a couple times, and there's a reason for that it has to occur prior to or concurrent with, and ideally prior to. The identity development piece is absolutely critical. It's essential. And it's one of those things that initially when we were starting to develop pieces of this, we thought we could sort of just say, well, just put it on your to-do list. But as we get into this, part of what we need to be thinking about is, again, who our school systems were built on, what culture it was normed on, right? In Wisconsin, 72% of our educators are white female. And when we think about that commonality, right, and not wanting to speak in generalized terms, but what that does is pulls in common experiences that 72% of the educators have thought about, work with, or familiar with, right? Not saying that everybody's identical, but there tend to be some commonalities. So when we think about that identity development piece, we have to be thinking about who we are in this work, how we show up, the things that we pay attention to, the things that we value. So an example of why this is critical is that when we look at what students of color get referral for versus what white students get referral for, we tend to see things like white students getting referral for very objective behaviors, attendance issues, weapons and drug violations, fighting and physical aggression. Nationally, we see a trend that students of color get referral for very subjective behaviors, things like defiance and disrespect and loitering, intimidation. What you know, or what you notice in that is that when we talk about subjective behaviors, those tend to be very sort of open to interpretation. They're based on our own experiences. The things that we bring in with us are prior experiences, right? So, my background, I'm white, male, social worker by training. I'm big. I'm 6 feet 4 inches tall. I was a child abuse investigator in my past life. So for me, and based on my history and my experiences, things that I view as intimidating are going to be significantly different than some colleagues that I've worked with. So if I have a student that is flinging mashed potatoes at me and telling me he's going to kick my butt, and the kid's in kindergarten, right? I'm not necessarily going to view this the same as somebody who has never encountered physical aggression. You kind of get where I'm going with this. So identity development really is essential for that because it's where we begin to embed culturally responsive practices. There's an emphasis on student and family identity, so understanding who the families are that we serve, what their cultural values are, their histories, what the school's identity is, how it's viewed in terms of the community, um, who our families are that show up constantly for family activity, who doesn't show up, where are areas of commonality, things like that, and then community identity. Um, Identity development work should result in some discomfort as people go through this. Discomfort is a sign of growth, right? If we are doing identity development work well with our staff, we are going to see people being uncomfortable. We're going to be having courageous conversations. We are going to be looking at things in a new way. And that newness as individuals is that sign that we are off center. And it's that opportunity for growth. We have well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll put a pin in that thing. The last piece, and I said this at the beginning, is that identity work is the linchpin of this concept of VAB, of validation, affirmation, building, and bridging. So if we want culturally responsive practices to take hold, we have to understand what we are bringing to the table as practitioners. We are not expecting students to assimilate to our systems. We are not expecting students to give up who they are, their histories, their identities when they come into our doors. What our jobs are is to understand who they are, what they're bringing to us, and how do we make explicit connections to our settings and our expectations. Okay, sorry.
So this first section on identity awareness looks like this. And essentially it says basically what Kent has been saying for the past few minutes, that to really increase our students' engagement and their feeling of belonging in school, we have to understand our own cultural identities and also have to understand and validate their identities and their values at the student, family, and community level. And that looks a lot different than what we have been sort of doing in the past in education in a lot of areas. And I won't say everywhere, but a lot of places where I have specifically been involved, or like classes that I've taken, we learn sort of that general information. These people from this culture tend to do this, or they like it when you do this, or they don't respond well when you do this. And those generalizations can lead to some pretty big misunderstandings in the communities that we work in, because we can't stay there. It's sort of like when you first do that risk ratio. You can start with a generalization, possibly. You can start with that risk ratio, but you have to dig deeper. You have to dig deeper into your data to figure out who specifically is showing a need and who's showing a mismatch with your system, just as you have to dig deeper into who really is in your community. Who are the families and the students that you're serving, and what do they bring to the table, and what does that culture mean to them? Because it might be vastly different from the generalizations that we frequently hear from the media or from different sources.
So one of the things that we made sure to include with the guide were some places to go for some information on how do you begin having identity awareness conversations with staff. There's three primary ones that we put into the guide. There's a lot of different options, but these are the three main ones that kind of show up in the research and show up in experience as being particularly effective. The first is called the 7 Experiences, and it is a professional development model that Wisconsin's own culturally responsive practices coordinator, Andrell Davis, created while she was working in the Madison School District. It's also the model that we use within the Wisconsin RTI Center for our own professional development to help our own staff, all of us, build our own awareness and culturally responsive practices. It's largely a free, pretty self-directed professional development model, relatively budget neutral, that starts with pretty easy, low threat, low intensity things like read a magazine article and discuss it, do a book study, go see a presenter. Depending on how your district or your building chooses to use something like this, one of the things that is beautiful about this model is that you can take staff to national or statewide conferences or to locations where their own culture is not the dominant culture. So in Melania's and my past and our background, we got invited to a conference in Savannah, Georgia a few years ago. And it was a conference focusing on African American male achievement and education reform. And the two of us and a couple of administrators from our district went to this, and out of the 400 educators attendees that were present, there were only about 7 people that looked like me, right? There were not a whole lot of white males around, and it was one of those places where all of a sudden my experiences were not the dominant experiences, where I was seeing language being used in a different way, where I was seeing nonverbal communication being used in a different way, where I was seeing common experiences that the other participants had that were not aligned to my own. And that's kind of where we want people to get as a part of this identity process, where they're able to kind of look at how they are moving in the world in relation to the families that we serve. Beyond diversity is another one of those professional development models. This one really is kind of proprietary. Pacific Education Group is the one that hosts it. They come into districts. They do have a cost for the training, but it is a way of also kind of getting people to think about identity. And lastly, Great Lakes Equity Center has some learning experiences. They're not necessarily sequential and comprehensive, but they are learning experiences that help people start thinking about identity. Anything you wanted to add, Melanie, to the experiences?
I don't think so. I think one of the things, and I will probably say this again later because we tend to repeat ourselves, but one thing that I think it's really important to consider with this work is that theory of, and you may or may not have heard this, but the theory of a failed intervention not being a neutral intervention. So when we think about students, if you start an intervention and the adults don't follow through, that sends a message to the student that if it's about behavior, that behavior can continue and can work to sort of stop whatever the adults are doing that the student doesn't want them to do. And that same theory applies to adults. So I would just say, be cautious when you start this work. This is not something to start kind of haphazardly, but this is something to be very purposeful about, because just like with kids, when you think about adults, a failed intervention is not neutral. A failed intervention will teach the adults that you're working with something, or it could set them up to have some barriers against the conversations that are really critical to have within this work. So each TFI item includes our timing is great today, Ken.
Yeah,
each TFI, no, I think it's funny. Each TFI item includes key features. So we have each of the items on the TFI at the tier 1 level divided out into these 5 bullets, and they're basically 1 page each. So if you're an external coach or an internal coach and you plan to try to take this and work with it with your team, I would suggest finding a way to address the identity thing and then looking at either your strengths or your needs and pulling out the page that refers to either of those. So I would say just pull out one page and start with one component on the TFI essentially. So what that looks like is the TFI big idea. So it'll define the original TFI item. And then there will be a cultural responsiveness elaboration or an enhancement that you could make to that item to be sure that it's responsive to the students and families you serve. And then there will be examples of what it can and should look like if it's done as intended. There will also be some non-examples, which have come from some schools that we've worked with in the past, because we don't quite always know what we don't know until we learn more. And then at the bottom, it will link to activities and resources, frequently directly linking to the appendix or a resource that you could use. So the first example that we have here is we just pulled out annual evaluation. The CR concept that it applies to of those 5 that we talked about in the beginning is data for equity. The big idea, so what the TFI item actually looks at is that schools are accountable to their communities and stakeholders and have an obligation to report the fidelity and effectiveness of their implementation. The culturally responsive elaboration here is that teams and staff understand that schools play a critical role in and are accountable to the communities they serve. So we're using those evaluation procedures to engage a wide and representative range of stakeholders in not just one-way communication where we tell them what's going on, but two-way communication where they actually have a voice and some ownership in the goals and progress of the district or the building. So there are some non-examples listed here. Teams not obtaining family or community feedback for the evaluation process or not sharing evaluation report beyond leadership teams or staff. And then there are some examples here of how this could look like. Ideally, in an ideal situation, we would see schools doing things off of this list. Reporting disaggregated data patterns to all stakeholders to let people know how all students are doing. Comparing disaggregated data trends to the school's mission and vision. Are we really achieving that excellence for all mission that we have on every school building? Teams actively seeking and incorporating family and community feedback in the evaluation. Utilizing existing community stakeholder groups to guide that evaluation, so reaching out to systems that are already in place and using those. Holding community outreach and discussion sessions to present annual evaluation results. And this is where these examples can be very uncomfortable for our schools, because I think in school settings and when I worked in schools, I was very comfortable asking questions that I already knew the answer to. When you start to open up a school to a two-way conversation with the families and the communities that you serve, you don't always know the answers that you're going to hear back. And in some cases, they can be very disheartening or uncomfortable or painful to hear. But without that perspective, we're really operating kind of blindly by just doing what we think is best from the one perspective that we have as educators. And then at the bottom, you can see just about off the page is the resources section. So those are the 5 areas that you saw in the slide just previous to this one. The first, the actual idea of the item, the elaboration of the item, the examples and non-examples, and then the resources at the bottom. And these slides go into more detail about that. So had I just clicked ahead, I could have pointed them out with the arrows. And you'll actually be able to read them a little bit better here as well.
I think maybe just scroll through in the interest of time so they can see them real quick. So the resource in the activity section, or the appendix, is where you're going to find things like lesson plans for how to use some of the activities that are referenced in the companion. So this example we pulled out of the appendix is this thing called a pie chart. And what the pie chart does is allows us to examine student understanding and identify where we need to be doing some more explicit teaching. It's called pie because of the Greek symbol pi, not like key lime or apple pie. When we talk about the pie chart, what it does is looks at a behavior expectation. So say, for example, responsible behavior in the classroom. And it's linked to the classroom matrix. So what does it look to be responsible when you are doing your own work? And what the pie chart is going to do is have the student make a connection to home. What does responsible at home look like when you're doing your own work? What does it look like in the school, in the classroom, in that particular routine? And then there's a place for the student to identify what questions they still have. This gives us a chance to kind of identify what the student comes in knowing versus where we want them to be, and helps us identify what instruction we need to do and make explicit. So it gives an example of that particular activity in a tool, but then it also talks about how do you teach your staff how to use something like this? How do you do a fidelity check to make sure that it was being done the right way? It gives the team tools to use as they're teaching staff and building their knowledge and understanding. So each thing that we reference in the TFI line item section, if we talk about a particular activity or a particular resource or a particular tool, there is going to be examples of how to use it or what it looks like in practice. Next. And then lastly, we have the research that was used as we were building the guide. Research from things like discipline patterns that we see nationally to how professional development works the best. So if you do start getting questions around, you know, is this just somebody's idea that they sketched on a bar napkin versus is there science to back it up? This is kind of that resource for you as well to understand where we drew a lot of this information from and how we were able to apply it to the tiered fidelity inventory.
I think we've addressed many of these questions already, but when you think about using the guide, again, I'll just reiterate, identify an area of strength on the TFI at the tier 1 level for your building, and you may want to reinforce that with a CR enhancement that you can find in each of the items in the guide, or identify the areas of need and then incorporate the CR concepts as you address them. But again, another bullet under there should be that you have to do that identity work as well. So when you use the guide, make sure that you're not just putting practices in place, but that you're also helping your staff understand the reason that you need to do that, the reason that it's imperative, and the fact that we all have cultures, we all have values that we sometimes aren't even aware of that impact our expectations for the people around us. Kent mentioned earlier that this whole plan is intended to be fairly budget neutral. I see that there's a hand up, so I'm going to call on you in just a second, Mackenzie. But what we're really hoping and what we hope that schools can do is map onto existing structures and resources as much as possible. That identity development work, as Kent mentioned, may involve some cost depending on the resources that you pick, but you'll want to be, that's really the only area that should involve a cost in this whole deal. So Mackenzie, it looks like you have a question. I'm going to unmute you and hopefully your microphone will work and you can ask your question quickly.
Hi, we're just joining in because our school ended. Can we, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Can we just
That's okay.
Start from the beginning somehow?
Yes, there will be a recording and I'm not exactly sure where it will be posted, but if you've registered with the link, then you will most likely get an email linking back to the recording. So you'll be able to watch it and hear all of our jokes at the end here twice.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
There.
That's all right. You're very welcome. All right. And then just to address these last two questions, and then we'll let you guys ask questions as well, because we have some time left yet. Kent mentioned earlier, just looking at the data alone isn't enough to create that desire or that even just the change in general. The data that you use and looking at your school's data can create some momentum, but it can't create the change alone. So you'll need to have a plan to address the identified issues and also some collaboration issues. And then as I mentioned earlier, this is really work that has to be very purposeful. So you go slow to go fast, essentially, because we don't want that failed intervention issue happening with our staff where then they have a bad experience with this work. And then they just have sort of a negative outlook on it anytime you bring it to the table. And the last question here, many of our schools have this question: can we just hire a diversity coordinator to address this issue? You can, and some people have hired some really exceptional coordinators to fill this position and to help guide this work. That is absolutely a possibility. What we want you to be sure to do is have it expand beyond a person. So you may have someone helping to coordinate things in your district or in your building, but you also have to couple that with those systemic changes and the practitioner changes and the practitioner will building and understanding that really need to happen in order for this work to sustain and keep going. So yes, you can hire a diversity coordinator, but please don't let your staff get the impression that the disproportionality in your district or your building is solely that person's responsibility to change, because it is something that we all own and we all participate in ways that we're not even aware of. And without starting to dig into that piece, we won't change this problem. We won't change the outcomes that we see. So if you have some questions, you can certainly raise your hand. We can unmute you and you can ask it out loud, or we can have you type it in the chat box and we'd be happy to read them out loud as well. Kent, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
We do have our contact information on the last slide, so we can put that up as well. The one thing I do want to kind of comment on with the go slow to go fast piece is that is going to be, as you get into this, a source of frustration for staff, because you're going to find that you have a coalition of the willing as you start this work of people that are motivated and excited to do this and want to get things changed very quickly. And that's normal and that's natural, and there is an urgency of now in this work. However, like Mulaney said, if we misjudge, if we do try to rush things without having that foundation in place, there is a risk of having that failed intervention and having that failed intervention phenomenon carry over. So I think basically the best way of saying this is you never have a second chance to make a first impression. That's kind of the thing to keep in mind as we talk about that go slow to go fast. And we had a question: will you speak to what the adjusted CR walkthrough might look like, consideration and preparation from an outside evaluator or coach, particularly asking students about race, ethnicity? So what we wanted to do when you look at the walkthrough part of the TFI prior to the elaboration, generally what you would see is walkthroughs being conducted by outside people, just kind of pulling kids at random. And what you saw was a tendency for really that random to not be so random. There would be a tendency to maybe avoid or be steered away from special education classrooms or from little kids, or you were starting to see a lot of the students that were picked kind of being of the dominant enrollment group. So in Wisconsin, dominant enrollment group for most school districts tends to be white. You were seeing the majority of students that were being stopped and interviewed being white students. So with the walkthrough tool, the guidance that's being put into place is really to make sure that while, we're trying to pick students at random, we're also making sure that it's not that random, that we are getting really demographic representation in our data, that it's not just, all white students that we're getting, or, the kids are having lunch at the same time because they're coming from the same classroom. We're really wanting to make sure that we have diversity in that opinion or the feedback that we're getting from students. That also includes with staff. Making sure that, and there's some guidance in there around imaging, as you're going into classrooms, as you are doing the walkthroughs, looking at the halls, looking at the posters and things like that. We're also wanting to consider whose culture, whose history, whose experiences are on display. I'm thinking of a school in the southern part of the state that was one of our demonstration sites years ago. They did a really fantastic job of having really all students being able to bring in things from home, their, things that represented their cultures, as well as staff cultures. Yes, I was there in February, and yes, they had, Black History Month as part of their celebration, but students were able to see themselves in the halls and in the classrooms year round, not just during February when it was Black History Month, or, in March or whatever. So really, those are some prompts that are put in on that crosswalk tool to help consider that environmental imaging as well, and making sure that we're getting information from a good representation of our students, really to kind of make sure that our systems are reaching all students the way it's intended. Good question. Anything you wanted to add to that, Malene?
No, I think you addressed it well.
Other questions? This is the fun part for us. Love the questions. Please give us questions. Going once. Going twice. All right, if there are no other questions, we want to respect your time. This has been recorded, and our contact information is there. If you would like a link to the recording, let us know. Otherwise, generally, they've been hosted on our website under the video resources. If you don't like speaking in front of a large group of people, we can hang out here for a couple minutes. But for everybody else, if you don't have anything and you want to get out of here, please feel free.
Is there any indication on the PBIS apps website to let us know if the TFI is being used with the CR field guide? I'm guessing you're talking about the actual PBIS assessment TFI like data entry page, and no, at this point there is not. So what we've talked about, and this was a pretty big conversation within the work group, is that we truly believe that PBIS alone, without the culturally responsive enhancements, what we see is that the data is, like, office discipline referrals are reduced, but they're reduced disproportionately. So that gap, if there's a gap between white students and, for example, African American students, that gap stays the same despite a reduction in both. So the comment or the belief that we came to as a group, like an equity disproportionality group, is that we truly believe that in order for PBIS to be true PBIS, it is culturally responsive. So I'm kind of walking around your question a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is that there is no CR PBIS necessarily, but that PBIS as it is not truly positive behavior interventions and supports for all students unless it is responsive to who those students are. So while we have these enhancements and we have this conversation about how to make it culturally responsive, what I'm trying to get at is that essentially on the TFI, in an ideal world, you would rank yourself on those scores sort of with all of this already embedded in the knowledge that you have. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm being a little confusing, but at this point, no, there is no way to say that you're using the guide along with the TFI. And there also is no intention of having another like CR TFI measure come out that would measure your work as it is on the guide. There are some measures linked in the guide that can help look at the practices that you're doing at that school-based level, but they're not something that's hosted on PBIS assessment. Was that muddy enough?
One other thing for you to consider too, if you're going to be sending people to the conference, Melanie and I are going to be doing a session on the second day, again, specific to the CR TFI Companion. So if you have other people that you think might want to see this, or you want to see this again or get more information or whatever, we will be offering this in person as well in the Dells in August.